We are addicted to a very specific American lie. It is a lie sold to us on the glossy covers of business magazines. It is repeated in keynote speeches, printed in best-selling autobiographies, and carefully curated by public relations departments in glass office buildings. The lie is the myth of the master plan. We are taught that the people who build multi-million-dollar empires are visionaries. We are told they saw the future with absolute clarity, retreated to a garage, and built a prototype through sheer, unbending willpower. We want to believe that wealth is the logical reward for a perfect strategy. But when you strip away the corporate mythology, when you look at the actual SEC filings, the historical timelines, and the original corporate structures, the narrative entirely collapses. The reality of how the world's most recognizable companies were actually built is not a story of genius. It is a story of profound desperation. It is a story of humiliating failure, crushing credit card debt, hidden billionaires, accidental coding errors, and the willingness to completely abandon your original dream when the market tells you that you are wrong. These are not the stories of visionaries. These are the stories of survivors. The screen of the laptop emits a cold blue light in the quiet of a small apartment. It is the year 2006. Two young men, Justin Kan and Emmett Shear, are staring at an active eBay auction. They are watching a timer count down. They are not buying something. They are selling their entire company. For the past year, they had poured their lives into a digital calendar application called Kiko Software. They believed it was going to change the world. They wrote the code. They pitched the investors. They envisioned the future. And then, without warning, a massive corporation quietly released a free product called Google Calendar. Overnight, Justin and Emmett were mathematically annihilated. Their master plan was rendered completely worthless. They did not pivot with grace. They panicked. They listed their dying company on eBay simply to extract whatever cash they could before the servers had to be shut off. The auction closed at $258,000. They took the money, walked away, and entered a state of complete burnout. With no grand vision left, they started a deeply unserious side project. They bought a camera, strapped it to Justin's head, and broadcast his daily life on the internet. They called it Justin.tv. It was a novelty, a joke. But Emmett Shear was bored. He liked playing a video game called StarCraft. So just for fun, he built a small, hidden side tab on the website where people could broadcast themselves playing video games. He didn't write a business plan for it. He just liked video games. Within months, the bandwidth costs for that tiny side tab exploded. Millions of people were logging in, ignoring the main website entirely and clicking on the gaming tab. The side project had aggressively cannibalized the main business. They were forced to spin it off into its own entity.
They called the new entity Twitch. In 2014, they sold that accidental side tab to Amazon for nearly $1 billion. The founders were not visionaries who predicted the multi-billion-dollar streaming industry. They were exhausted developers who sold their actual dream on eBay and got rich off a distraction they built out of boredom. This is the hidden architecture of extreme wealth. The main event is almost always an illusion. The byproduct is what quietly takes over the world. Look at Tobias Lütke. It is the early 2000s. He is standing in a freezing warehouse, staring at boxes of physical inventory, snowboards. He is a dyslexic programmer who just wants to run a side hustle selling winter sports gear online. He calls the company Snow Devil, and it is a massive failure. Nobody is buying the snowboards. But Tobias has a very specific problem. The existing e-commerce software of the era, platforms like Yahoo stores, are incredibly clunky, expensive, and difficult to use. Out of pure frustration, he decides to build his own checkout software, using a relatively new programming language called Ruby on Rails. He just wants to sell his snowboards. But the snowboards continue to collect dust. The business is bleeding cash. They are weeks away from missing payroll. The side hustle is dying. The story of the self-made, bootstrapped genius ends right here in the cold warehouse, unless you introduce the ghost in the machine. A telecom executive turned angel investor named John Phillips looks at the dying snowboard company. He doesn't care about the snowboards. He looks at the checkout code Tobias wrote. Phillips writes a check for $250,000, taking a massive 20% equity lifeline in the company. With that cash, Tobias stops selling snowboards. He packages the checkout code and begins selling it to other desperate merchants. He renames the snowboard company Shopify.
Today, Shopify powers a massive percentage of global e-commerce, but the origin story rarely mentions John Phillips. The PR narrative prefers the image of the lone, struggling coder. It rarely acknowledges that without a $250,000 injection from a corporate executive, the checkout code would have died in a warehouse full of unsold winter gear. The public loves the myth of the solo founder. We love the idea of an individual standing against the world, armed with nothing but a brilliant idea. But when you look closely at the capitalization tables of the world's fastest-growing companies, the solo founder is almost always a carefully constructed optical illusion. Consider the story of Bumble. The media narrative is flawless. It is pitched as the ultimate solo female founder revenge story. Whitney Wolfe Herd leaves Tinder amid controversy. She strikes out on her own. She builds a feminist dating app from scratch in a male-dominated tech industry, empowering women to make the first move. She takes the company public and becomes the youngest self-made female billionaire in history. It is an incredible story. It is inspiring. It is on the cover of every major magazine. But it completely ignores the underlying math. Bumble was not a bootstrapped side hustle built in a garage. It was heavily bankrolled from the very first day by a man named Andrei Andreev. Andreev was a Russian billionaire and the founder of the European dating giant Badoo. When Wolfe Herd left Tinder, Andreev reached out. He provided an initial $10 million investment. He provided the entire underlying back-end engineering infrastructure from Badoo. In exchange, Andreev took a staggering 79% initial stake in Bumble. Whitney Wolfe Herd was brilliant at marketing. She understood the brand. She executed the vision perfectly. But Bumble was an incubated spin-off of a Russian billionaire's existing empire, not a lone startup fighting for survival. The media sold the story of the underdog because the underdog sells magazines. They ignored the 79% equity stake because the truth of corporate leverage is simply too boring for the cover of Forbes. This erasure of the hidden partner is not an isolated incident. It is a fundamental mechanism of modern corporate storytelling.
Look at Gymshark. The legend of Gymshark is perfectly optimized for social media. Ben Francis, a 19-year-old kid, hand-sewing workout gear in his parents' house while delivering for Pizza Hut to make ends meet. It is the ultimate hustle culture narrative. But the reality of Gymshark's origin is entirely different. Gymshark did not even start as a clothing company. It was a cheap drop-shipping website selling fitness supplements. It took them 6 entire weeks to make a single sale. More importantly, Ben Francis was not alone. The narrative systematically omits his co-founder, Lewis Morgan. Morgan was there from day one. He helped build the infrastructure. He owned a massive chunk of the company's equity. While Ben Francis became the public face, the charismatic visionary on Instagram, Lewis Morgan operated in the shadows. In 2020, during a massive private equity deal with General Atlantic, Morgan quietly exited the company. He sold his stake and walked away with an estimated $130 million. The lone genius myth is a marketing tool. The reality is that empires require capital, infrastructure, and hidden partners who are perfectly happy to let you take the credit, as long as they get to take the cash. But what happens when there is no billionaire? What happens when there is no angel investor to write the check? This brings us to the dark, humiliating reality of true bootstrapping. A young woman named Sarah Blakely is standing in the aisles of a Barnes & Noble bookstore. She is looking for a textbook on how to write a legal patent. She has a prototype for a new type of undergarment. She went to a patent attorney in Georgia, and they quoted her between $3,000 and $5,000 to draft the paperwork. She doesn't have $5,000, so she buys the textbook and writes the legal document herself.
She takes her prototype and begins calling hosiery mills in North Carolina. She is looking for a manufacturer. She calls every single mill in Asheboro. She is rejected by every single one. Nobody wants to talk to a woman with no money, no corporate backing, and a weird prototype. The doors are completely shut. The market has rejected her.
The story ends here, until a mill owner named Ted Luckenbill finally calls her back. He doesn't call her back because he believes in her business plan. He calls her back because he took the prototype home and showed it to his 3 daughters. His daughters told him the idea was brilliant. Ted Luckenbill took a chance on Sarah Blakely entirely because of the women in his house. She called the company Spanx. The survival of the business did not come down to an impenetrable business plan. It came down to the sheer luck that a mill owner happened to have daughters who understood the product. You see this exact same razor-thin margin of survival in the early days of Under Armour. Kevin Plank loves to tell the story of inventing the sweat-wicking shirt in his grandmother's basement. What is rarely discussed is how he actually paid for the fabric. Plank was a football player at the University of Maryland. He ran a quiet side hustle on campus called Cupid's Valentine, selling roses to college students. He saved exactly $17,000 from selling flowers. He used that flower money to buy the first synthetic fabrics. But by 1996, the flower money was entirely gone. Plank was dead broke. He had racked up $40,000 in debt, spread across 5 different personal credit cards. He was operating on the absolute edge of financial ruin. One missed payment, one aggressive creditor, and Under Armour would have been liquidated before it ever existed. He survived only because he landed a massive, desperate sale to the Georgia Tech football team at the exact moment his credit lines maxed out. The line between a visionary billionaire and a bankrupt college student selling roses is invisible. It is often decided by a single phone call, a single check, or a single week of unexpected cash flow. Sometimes the multi-million-dollar idea is born entirely out of poverty. It is December 1969. A 16-year-old boy named Michael Kittredge is standing in his parents' kitchen. He is deeply embarrassed. Christmas is approaching, and he has absolutely zero money to buy his mother a gift. In a moment of pure desperation, he takes a handful of childhood crayons, throws them into a pot, and melts them down on the stove. He pours the colored wax into a milk carton to mold a crude, homemade candle. It is a pathetic gift, but it is all he has. Before he can give it to his mother, a neighbor, Mrs. Pat Gallagher, walks into the kitchen. She sees the crayon candle sitting on the counter. She doesn't think it's pathetic. She thinks it's charming. She asks Michael if she can buy it. He sells it to her for exactly $1.36. Michael Kittredge doesn't put the money in his pocket. He takes that $1.36, walks to the store, and buys actual commercial paraffin wax. He uses the wax to make 2 new candles. He gives one to his mother, and he sells the other. He called the company Yankee Candle. There was no market research. There was no pitch deck. There was only the humiliating reality of being too poor to buy a Christmas gift, and a neighbor who happened to have $1.36 in her purse. This is the recurring theme of the hidden economy. The greatest innovations do not come from people trying to change the world. They come from people trying to solve a tiny, immediate, and incredibly annoying problem. Look at the founders of MailChimp, Ben Chestnut and Dan Curzius. Dan wasn't a Silicon Valley prodigy. He was a former competitive skateboarder and a real estate agent. They were running a failing web design agency called the Rocket Science Group. They were building websites for corporate clients to keep the lights on. But their clients kept asking for something they absolutely hated doing. The clients wanted custom email newsletters. Ben and Dan despised building these newsletters. The coding was tedious, the formatting always broke. It was miserable work. So purely out of spite, to avoid having to do the work themselves, they wrote a clunky, heavily flawed piece of automated code that allowed their clients to design their own emails. They hated the email tool. In the mid-2000s, they actually debated shutting the entire thing down so they could focus on their real business of web design. They eventually realized the web design business was worthless, and the clunky tool they built to avoid talking to their clients was generating millions of dollars. They renamed the tool MailChimp. You see the exact same accidental discovery in the origins of GitHub.
Chris Wanstrath, Tom Preston Warner, and PJ Hyatt were working day jobs at PowerSet and CNET. On the weekends, they built a side project to help developers share code. They didn't even register it under a serious name. The official corporate entity was legally registered as Logical Awesome LLC. When they launched the site, they had a very immediate problem. Server hosting costs were expensive. They couldn't afford to pay the monthly server bills out of their own pockets.
So they made a simple decision. They would let people host open source code for free, but if a business wanted to keep their code private, Logical Awesome LLC would charge them a monthly fee. They didn't do this to revolutionize enterprise software. They did it so they wouldn't have to pay the server bill themselves. By charging for private repositories, they accidentally stumbled into one of the most lucrative business-to-business software-as-a-service revenue models in history. GitHub was eventually acquired by Microsoft for $7.5 billion. The greatest companies are rarely designed. They are stumbled into in the dark. Max Temkin and his high school friends were sitting around trying to entertain themselves for a New Year's Eve party. They wrote a bunch of terrible, offensive jokes on pieces of paper. They called the prototype Cartanus. They played it, they laughed, the party ended. Months later, they uploaded the game to the internet as a free PDF document under a Creative Commons license. Anyone could download it, print it, and play it for free. They had absolutely no intention of starting a physical manufacturing company. But human behavior is lazy. People downloaded the PDF, but they quickly realized that sitting at a kitchen table with a pair of scissors, manually cutting out hundreds of little paper squares, was incredibly annoying. The fans started emailing Max. They didn't want the free PDF. They wanted to pay him to print the cards on heavy cardstock and mail it to them in a physical box. Max didn't launch a massive Kickstarter because he had a vision for the board game industry. He launched the Kickstarter because people refused to use their own scissors. The physical version of Cards Against Humanity was born entirely out of consumer annoyance. Sometimes the brand identity itself is a complete accident. Rob Kalin was an amateur carpenter. He spent his time making computers out of wood in his apartment while doing freelance web design to pay rent. He wanted a marketplace to sell his weird wooden computers. He sat down and coded an entire platform in just 2.5 months. He needed a name. He didn't hire a branding agency.
He was sitting in his apartment, watching the classic Italian film 8½. He didn't speak Italian. He was just listening to the audio. He kept hearing the actors repeat a phrase that sounded like Etsy. He thought it was a completely nonsense word. He liked the sound of it. He decided to name his multi-billion-dollar artisan marketplace Etsy. Years later, he found out that the actors in the movie were actually saying AC, which simply translates to, oh yes. The name of a multi-billion-dollar publicly traded company is the result of an amateur carpenter mishearing a foreign language film in his living room. Even the most dominant retail franchises on Earth are built on layers of mundane mistakes. Fred DeLuca was 17 years old. He had absolutely zero interest in the food industry. He did not care about sandwiches. He did not care about restaurants. He had one singular goal in his life. He wanted to become a doctor. He needed money to pay for his medical school tuition at the University of Bridgeport. He approached a family friend named Peter Buck and asked for advice. Buck handed the teenager a check for $1,000 and told him to open a submarine sandwich shop. Fred took the money and opened a tiny storefront. He named it Pete's Super Submarines. They needed customers, so they took part of the $1,000 and bought advertising time on a local radio station. But the audio fidelity of mid-1960s local radio was terrible. When the announcer read the script, the transmission was heavily distorted. People driving in their cars didn't hear Pete's Super Submarines. Through the static, they thought the announcer was saying Pizza Marines.
Customers started showing up to the store asking for pizza. Fred realized the name was a complete disaster. They had to pivot immediately. They changed the name to Pete's Subway, and eventually just Subway. Fred DeLuca never became a doctor. He became the architect of the largest restaurant franchise on the planet, all because of a distorted radio signal. But what happens when the accident goes perfectly? What happens when you build the empire, you get the money, and you achieve total market dominance, but you hate the thing you built? This is the psychological prison of the reluctant founder.
Steve Ells is a classically trained chef. He graduated from the prestigious Culinary Institute of America. His absolute dream in life was to open a high-end, fine-dining French restaurant. He wanted linen tablecloths, perfectly paired wines, and complex culinary architecture. But fine dining restaurants are incredibly expensive to open, and they almost always fail. Steve needed cash. He needed a mechanism to fund his real dream. In 1993, he took an $85,000 loan from his father to open a tiny, hyper-efficient taco stand in Denver, Colorado. The menu was incredibly limited. The ingredients were simple, the assembly line was fast. He designed it strictly as a cash cow, a side hustle to print money so he could finally go build his French restaurant. He called the taco stand Chipotle.
The concept was a violent, immediate success. The line wrapped around the block. The cash flow was staggering. He opened a second location, then a third. In early interviews, Steve Ells admitted something deeply unsettling. He admitted that every time he opened a new Chipotle location, he felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. He felt like he was betraying himself. He was a trained chef, standing in a sterile kitchen, watching teenagers wrap thousands of identical aluminum cylinders. He had successfully built a multi-billion-dollar empire, but it was an empire of fast food, the exact thing he despised. The cash cow grew so massive, so hungry for capital and attention, that the fine dining French restaurant never materialized. Steve Ells became incredibly wealthy, but he became wealthy by abandoning the only thing he actually wanted to do. This is the final, hidden truth of the side hustle. The market does not care about your dream. The market does not care about your master plan. Kevin Systrom learned this in a bar. Systrom was a developer who had built an incredibly complex application called Bourbon. It was a check-in app, similar to Foursquare, but heavily targeted toward whiskey drinkers. It allowed users to check in at bars, earn points, post pictures, and coordinate meetups. Systrom was incredibly proud of the code. It was complex, it was robust. And it was a complete, bloated failure. The app was too complicated. Nobody used the check-in feature. Nobody cared about the points. The only thing people were doing on the app was uploading photos of their drinks. Systrom refused to see the reality. He clung to his master plan. He had left his safe job at Nextstop to build this company, and he was terrified of admitting that he had built the wrong thing. The breaking point did not happen in a boardroom. It happened on a beach in Mexico. Systrom was on vacation with his girlfriend, Nicole Schutz. He was frustrated. He asked her why she never uploaded photos to his app. Nicole was blunt. She told him she wouldn't use his app because her photos looked terrible. She told him that his friend Greg always posted amazing photos, and until her photos looked as good as Greg's, she refused to use the software. Systrom tried to defend his code. He explained that Greg was using external filter applications to make his photos look better before uploading them. Nicole looked at him and said, "Then you should probably add filters." It was a devastating realization. The massive, complex, location-based check-in app that Systrom had poured his life into was entirely worthless. The market didn't want his genius code. The market wanted a simple button that made mediocre photos look beautiful. Systrom walked back to his hotel room in Mexico, sat down at his laptop, and coded the very first photo filter. He called it X Pro 2. He stripped away the check-ins. He stripped away the whiskey. He stripped away the points. He threw his entire master plan in the garbage, and he built a simple feed for filtered photos. He renamed the app Instagram. When you trace the history of this invisible machine, from the melting crayons in the kitchen, to the rejected prototypes in North Carolina, to the screaming audio of the radio ad, and the digital clock counting down on the eBay auction, you begin to feel a lingering, heavy discomfort. You realize that the titans of industry did not predict the future. They simply survived the chaos. They were the ones who were willing to look at the dying snowboard shop, the bloated whiskey app, and the exhausted email clients, and realize that their original dream was dead.
We look at the sprawling corporate campuses and the soaring stock prices, and we see the illusion of perfect control. We see the carefully constructed mythology of the visionary founder, leading us into the future with mathematical certainty. But stand in the quiet of a cold warehouse. Look closely at the maxed-out credit cards sitting on the kitchen table. There is no master plan. There is only the pivot. And the architects of the machine are simply the ones who realized that the side project was the only thing keeping